Despite the fact that technologies themselves are developing more and more each month, I think it's probably easier to say each month rather than each year these days, we also have difficulties in the way in which we implement them. So I'd like to talk a little bit about my own experiences and how to get our learners to use these devices more effectively, and some considerations that we might like to bear in mind as we do this. Now, I think we could probably agree that these days that our mobile devices, and I've listed a few different types, are around us all the time. Okay, these days I don't need to put up my hand, ask people to put up their hand and say how many people have a mobile device. I'm pretty sure that we can say it's 100% of people will have a mobile device here. Now, regardless of what device you use, whether it's Android, iOS, iPad, or other type of tablet, I'm sure that you use it for several different functions throughout the day. I'm sure that you would use it for at least 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 of these each day of your lives. So we can see that these devices that we are carrying with us have become an integral part of our everyday life. Could you imagine surviving without your mobile device these days? I think probably most of us would find it quite difficult. And if we look at our students, many of them, particularly when they're involved in social networking, would find it even more difficult than we would. So we know that these devices are with us all the time. So when we look at the nature of mobile learning, now the advantage is, and this is what people who first started to pick up the idea of mobile learning in the early days of mobile learning, was that we can exploit small amounts of time and space for learning. So instead of having to sit down and do a concentrated burst of activity with learning, then it's possible to use a small amount of time, use this gap time to be able to study. And mobile devices make it possible to do this. Yes, it's true. But at the same time, we also need to bear in mind that sometimes these times are unanticipated. We don't expect we're going to have some time. Now, if that's the case, what it means is that the device that we are carrying with us needs to be a part of our everyday life. And that is one of the advantages of using mobile devices. Okay, we're not likely to be carrying our textbook with us when we go to see our friends. But perhaps we might have a mobile device with us, which means that if we are so motivated, then we might take the time to use the device to engage in small bursts of activity. Now, as Mark was talking just before, when we look at mobile learning, I think we can go beyond the idea of saying that mobile learning is something that only happens outside the classroom. And in fact, the majority of the research that we have seen in the field is actually about using mobile devices in the classroom. And probably we would have a positive view to say that, well, when we use mobile devices, that we can see people working together. In this example, the teacher is assisting the student to use the mobile device in their learning in some capacity. Now, the nice thing about the in-class situation is, for the most part, the teacher is able to see what's going on in the classroom. Well, mostly. You have to look carefully at the teacher. Okay? We can't always see what's happening in the classroom either. So if this can happen in a classroom situation where the teacher is present, what happens outside of the classroom? Okay? When our learners are out in the wide world, then their learning is largely unsupervised. Learners may encounter difficulties, they may encounter problems, but in many cases they don't know what to do when they face these problems. It becomes important for us as teachers to get a bigger idea of what the context is. Now, a common misconception that we see with regard to mobile learning is that mobile learning equals autonomous learning. I argue that they're not the same thing. Okay? Just because someone does something outside of class doesn't mean that it's done autonomously. If I say to my students, you must complete this essay by tomorrow or this activity by tomorrow, use your mobile device to do it, we wouldn't call this autonomous. This is activities which take place outside of the class, but the learner isn't doing it of their own volition. Autonomy is something which takes time to develop. It takes time for learners to be able to engage in activities without being forced to do so. Now, another difficulty we often see with learning outside of the classroom is that which we do know about the learning is based on reported data. We ask our learners, what did you do outside of the class? And they'll say, I did this, 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 this. But we often see that there are discrepancies between what learners say they did and what they actually did. Okay? So many learners may be feeling that they're doing activities more so, but perhaps they're not being as effective in their learning as they might be. Now, mobile learning is, as I mentioned before, it's faced with challenges. Okay, and as I gave you the quotation before, we can see that mobile learning is something which is really fraught with distractions. If we can see two examples here, if we look at the picture on the right, we can see inside a train, people using mobile devices. I mean, if we're going to use mobile devices, we're going to be using them in the outside world, so it's likely that we will have external disruptions. Okay, if we're sitting in a train or sitting in a cafe, then we're likely to be interrupted by what happens around us. But with our new mobile devices, it's also possible for these disruptions to occur within the device itself. Our learners may be engaging in some type of activity and a message pops through Facebook or Line or some other activity or application, and well, we know learners and we're probably guilty of it ourselves. If we have to study but a message comes in, which one do we give precedence to? And we're likely to give precedence to the message. Okay, so this is a disruption which can occur not only outside of the device, but also disruptions which occur within the device itself. Now, with mobile learning, when we look at the nature of mobile learning, we can see that we can have two different types of learning. Now, Mark actually mentioned these two different types in his presentation as well, which is what we call pull learning and push learning. Now, just to give you a brief description of what these actually are. Pull learning refers to situations when the learners need to seek out information for themselves. So they may have an app, and then we say to our learners, please access the app. Okay? When they do this, this is pull learning. In contrast, we have what is push learning, where information is pushed to the learners without them needing to find it. It's pushed towards them, and then they can access it easily from that way. Okay? So two examples. With the pull mechanism, we can say that learners need to take the initiative themselves. Okay, they need to say, okay, take out my phone, start the app, or whatever it is that we're using, and they need to do this by themselves. Now, there's lots of different types of things they can do. There could be web-based tools, communication tools, different types of apps, and so on and so forth. I've done quite a bit of research myself using apps for vocabulary learning. This is a pull mechanism, as I mentioned, so learners have to do it by themselves. In contrast, we have what's called the push mechanism. The push mechanism is when information is sent directly to the learner's device. Okay, so in that case, we can say that the learners really have little option but to check the incoming message. Of course, they can ignore it, but probably in most cases, when someone receives the message, they're likely to at least look at it. And there have been several studies in which this push mechanism has been investigated as well, such as vocabulary lessons through Thornton and Housen, this is going back a long time, and more recent research by Kennedy, Levy, and myself. So when we push information onto the learners, then we're starting the learning happening, we're starting the engagement with the device for learning, and this is often linked to, from my own research, that learners will then move to pull modes as well. So how can we motivate our learners to engage in devices? One of the problems that we've seen in research is that many learners do not engage in mobile learning even if the devices are available, even if the tools are available. Teachers tend to be more enthusiastic about mobile learning than learners do. And one of the problems with that is that learners often have not had enough training in the tool to be able to use it effectively. Now, Phil Hubbard, back in 2013, was pushing the case of a need for learner training. And he said that many learners just simply aren't ready to engage in mobile learning. We make assumptions that learners are capable of using mobile devices for learning purposes before they actually are. Our learners can use mobile devices for non-learning purposes very well. Our learners know how to use Facebook, they know how to use a range of different tools. But it is a fallacy to make the assumption that if learners can use a device for non-learning purposes, then they can also use the device for learning purposes. They are very, very different skills. So Phil Hubbard argued that there is a need to have learner training in action, where we train our learners how to use the device for learning purposes on an ongoing basis. Now, we see in many studies, a lot of research really says after the project is concluded, they say, well, my learners didn't engage in the activities as much as I hoped, and we should have trained them better. So a lot of researchers keep discovering this idea of learner training. Okay, we should train our learners, we should train our learners. But there hasn't been that much discussion as to what learner training actually is. But in recent years, it's starting to become a more important part of research, and we're starting to see it in research practice and in standards. But learner training is quite difficult. To be able to train our learners, there's also a need to train the teachers as well. And many teachers themselves do not have the skills to train their learners. And I'll explain in a moment a brief study myself that I conducted with Phil Hubbard, where we trained learners and we could see a significant difference in the results using the same tools, just through providing extra training for the learners. Okay? Now, we've talked about what's called domain-based training in mobile learning. And this, we talked about technical training, which is how to use the tool. Now, in many cases, when we see people talking about training their learners, we see technical training. Here is an app, here is how you use it. Frequently, this occurs once at the beginning of a course, and the assumption is made from that time that the learners know how to use it. Usually they do not. Technical training needs to happen on an ongoing basis. Learners try it, they forget how to use it, they don't know how to understand some features, they do know how to use other features. We need to keep training on an ongoing basis how to use the tool. That's number one. But then we also argue that there are two other integral parts of training which are not given the attention that they deserve. One of them is strategic training, which is not only how to use the tool, but how to use the tool for learning purposes. Okay? These are not the same. Okay? Not only how to use the tool, but then how to use strategies, employ strategies to use this tool for learning purposes. And the third one is why to use it. Many times we say to our students, you should use this. But do we provide detailed information about why it's important to do so? Frequently we know, and we assume that our learners will know too. But when you talk with students, many students say afterwards, well, I don't know why I did that, I just did it because the teacher told me to. Okay? Is that good enough? In my own research, it's not. Really, the students need to know, they need to see why they're using something to be able to use it more effectively. Now, a study that I ran with Phil Hubbard over 2 years in 2013 and 2014. 2013 was how I used to teach the class. I gave technical training in how to use a vocabulary learning app for learners of English in Japan. In the first week, I gave them technical training, and then I gave them some ongoing technical training as I saw that they had difficulties. It wasn't very systematic. It just happened as I saw that the students had difficulties. Strategic training was given periodically. Usually I gave strategies to my students if they performed badly in weekly quizzes. So I could say, oh, well, they're not doing very well. Maybe I should give them some help in how to engage in the activities more fully. Okay? I should stress at the time I thought that this was a very good way of teaching. I thought that I was being understanding, I was helping my students, and I was giving them the guidance that they needed. And in one way, I guess I was. But I came to see that there's possibly more to the training that could enhance the learning experience for them. No, pedagogical training didn't occur at all. Okay? Now, if we compare this with 2014, we gave technical training in the first week, and systematically, using hands-on discussion, learners talked with each other about how to use the device, how they use the device. This is also incorporated in strategic training. Strategies were given to students. Students talked in groups about the strategies that they used, why they used them, what worked, what didn't work. And we also gave ongoing pedagogical training. Students were able to explain to other students in class discussions why they were using a mobile device to accomplish certain learning goals. This is something that was different from the 2013 cohort. Now, if we look at the results, we can see that there was a huge difference in the engagement of the learners in the activities. Okay, this is 2013, 2014 data. Total activities completed by learners in 2013, I don't know if you can see it, was 2,784 activities. 2014, same device, same environment. The only difference was the training was different. 5,292. Learners were twice as likely to engage in the activities than they were before they received training. Now, the tool that I developed was actually able to be used either on a desktop computer or a laptop, or on a mobile device, like a mobile phone or a tablet. I left that choice to the students. I felt that if students didn't want to use a mobile phone, they should have the right to make the decision themselves, so they could use either. Now, if you have a look in 2013, only 6.2% of the activities were carried out on mobile devices. In 2014, it was 38.9%. There was a massive increase in the amount of activities that were carried out on mobile devices through providing extra training. You can also see the amount of time spent on the activities increased dramatically, and learners were undertaking far more activities. They were more active users of the technology for learning purposes because they knew why they were doing it, and they knew how to do it, and they could articulate their reasons to others. So what impact did this have on achievement? Okay, if we have a look, the two groups were fairly comparable in 2013-2014 based on pre-testing. We can see, however, actually 2014 accomplished lower on the first mini-quiz than 2013. There was a minus 8% difference between the two groups. There were 40 learners in 2013, 41 learners in 2014. Minus 8, if we see after the students started receiving the training, there was a 1% increase by mini-quiz 2, mini-quiz 3, it increased to 2, then to 3, then to 12, then to 13, then to 12. We are seeing a consistent increase in learner achievement compared with previous years. 2013 was representative also of previous years, and there wasn't much difference between 2013 and 2012 and the years before that. So we can see that learner training had a clear impact on outcomes. Also, we could see that learners were more likely to use their mobile devices instead of using only the PC. If you look in 2013, we can see usage was very, very small. Particularly at the end, you can see that learners didn't use the mobile device at all. Now, they said that they were doing other things with the computer, so it just made sense to use the computer to do the vocabulary activities as well, which is fair enough. But if we compare that with 2014, you can see usage was completely different. Okay, learners were far more likely to use the mobile devices and use it more regularly. Okay, I'm coming to the end. I know that I don't have very much time, so just to talk about one more point that we do see with the use of mobile learning or mobile tools, and that is the social aspect of mobile learning. Okay, now we know that social networking is a common function of mobile devices, and a lot of people are arguing that we can use social networking for learning. But we do need to keep one point in mind, and that is that social networking has no inherent learning design. The learning design comes from the teacher. We can't just simply say, okay, here's Facebook, okay, talk. Okay? Usually results in very meaningless discussion, or in most cases, no discussion at all. It's the same as having two students talk in class and say, okay guys, talk. They're very unlikely to do that. Okay? There needs to be a learning design, there needs to be a pedagogy put in place by the teacher first. We also need to bear in mind that not all groups have the same view of mobile learning for, social networking for learning purposes. Okay? In Singapore, Mok mentioned that students were very enthusiastic about using Facebook for discussing their learning. However, in Taiwan, in the same year, Leo showed that students were very negative about using social networking on their mobile devices for learning purposes. It had a lot to do with privacy, it had a lot to do with what information they were revealing to others. Okay? The last one is that a recent study that I saw, it's just this year, I saw it last week actually, by Tran in Vietnam. She mentioned that she tried to use social networking as a means of having students engage in learner training. What she found was that learners found Facebook very useful as a push mechanism. So if information was passed on to the learners, it triggered them to learn, but they were not enthusiastic about actually engaging in discussions through the Facebook medium themselves. Okay, so I'll come to a conclusion and say that we can see from the range of studies, the range of exhibitions we've seen outside, that there's enormous potential for using mobile devices for learning purposes. We do need to think about what the role of mobile devices are. We need to think of it in terms of a push mechanism and as a pull mechanism. Okay? This might include tools such as social networking, but we do need to remember that at all times that learners will not be familiar with learning through mobile devices, and they need training to make that possible. Through training, we can greatly enhance the learning experience for our learners. And thank you very much.